This is one of those sewing projects that's very satisfying to watch it all come together. Today I'm sewing the Victory Tank by Chalk and Notch Patterns. There are two views for this pattern, giving you the option to sew with or without the straps. I'm choosing the strapped version for today's sew along. If you enjoy a good puzzle, and I know if you love to sew, you probably do, you'll love putting together this tank. There's a lot of turning things inside out and right side out and understitching, and we're using the burrito method, which always feels like you're doing a magic trick. The material I've chosen for the outer fabric is a lightweight 100% cotton, and for the lining I've chosen a lightweight, almost sheer rayon blend. I hope you join me today in sewing this very satisfying make that you can be proud of. Let's get started. Here is my front bodice piece for the AB size, which does not include bust darts. If you're sewing the CD size, you'll want to pin and sew your darts at this point for the main front bodice, as well as for the lining front bodice. Place your back bodice pieces right sides together and pin together from the notch to the bottom of the garment. And repeat for your back lining pieces. Sew both seams from the notch, backstitching to secure with a 3/8 inch seam allowance down to the bottom of the garment. Now that those seams are sewn, we're going to clip into the notches a little bit further to the stitching line, but not beyond. Now that we've clipped into the seam allowance, we can finish the bottom half of the seam from the notch to the bottom of the garment for the main and the lining. Then we'll press those seam allowances for the main and lining pieces to the right side. Fold each of your straps right sides together and pin the long edge. And sew each long edge with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And then trim each seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. Turn each of your straps right side out and give them all a press. Then using a ruler and chalk, I'm going to mark my 3/8 inch stitching lines along both edges of each piece. I'm also going to mark the 3/8 inch seam allowance at the center front of my front bodice piece, as well as the top shoulders. Then we'll align the seam allowance markings on our strap pieces for the unnotched edges with the seam allowance marking that we made in the center of the front bodice, making sure that the V intersection is at the seam allowance and that it's in line with the center front, and pin in place. Sew this in place just under 3/8 of an inch. Then take each of your straps and flip them upward, twisting the top of the strap so that it's right sides together with the top of the shoulder, aligning your notches and the lines that you drew for the seam allowance, and pin in place. And sew those straps in place just under 3/8 of an inch. Now for the back strap and the back bodice piece, place one of the short raw edges along the raw edge at the top of the V, 3/8 of an inch down from the raw edge of the neckline, and pin in place. And then sew that in place along this side only with less than a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Now place your front and back bodice pieces right sides together and pin the shoulder seams. Sew both shoulders with a 3/8 inch seam allowance and press the seams open. Also place your lining pieces right sides together and pin and sew those shoulder seams at 3/8 and press the seams open. Here is my front and back bodice piece opened out flat at the shoulder seams, with the right side of the material facing me. Place your lining and the main fabric right sides together along the neckline and pin in place from the notch at the bottom of the back V all around the neckline, stopping at the top of the neckline on the opposite side. Now that that's pinned, we can start our sewing at the bottom of the V placing the needle right at the notch where our stitching started earlier. And then sew around the neckline with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, pivoting around the neckline, and then stopping at the top of the opposite neckline. So we're leaving the opposite side of the V open for now. Sew slowly and carefully around the neckline so that you don't catch the loose edges of the straps as you sew. Now that that's sewn, we'll clip the curves of the neckline. Now we'll turn the main and lining pieces right side out. Then we want to place that loose end of the back strap right sides together with the top of the neckline on the opposite side. Once those are aligned, hold that in place and flip the main and lining fabric for that back slit area once again so that they're facing right sides together. Then we can pin the remaining side of that back V and pin down to the notch at the bottom of the back V. Then we can sew that back V closed from the notch to the top of the neckline, backstitching at both points to secure with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. Here is that top sewn corner at the top of the back V. I'm going to clip the corner to reduce bulk. And I'll do that on both sides of the back V. Now we're going to understitch the back V and the neckline, having the seam allowance pressed toward the lining, starting down as close as we can get to the bottom of the V, backstitching to secure. We're going to sew the seam allowance to the lining about 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line. Then once we get to the neckline, you can backstitch to secure, and then start a fresh set of stitches at the other side of that neckline point, once again backstitching to secure and continuing to sew that seam allowance to the lining all around the neckline, starting and stopping your stitching around that neckline point on the other side and continuing to sew the seam allowance to as far as you can get once again to the bottom of that V. Now that that's understitched, turn everything back right side out and give the neckline and back slit a good press. Once that's pressed, take your lining and main fabrics on one side of the arm side and roll it toward the other arm side. Now that that's rolled toward the center and the arm side of the main fabric is facing you, put your hand underneath to grab the arm side of the lining fabric and flip it over top so that they're right sides facing. And pin the arm side. Then we'll sew the arm side with a 3/8 inch seam allowance from underarm to underarm. Careful as you sew so that you don't catch any of that rolled up bodice material in your stitches. Then we'll clip the curves of the arm side. Then we can pull out that rolled up material through this tunnel. Now we have a nice cleanly finished arm side. Repeat the entire process to do that burrito method on the other side. Now both of my arm sides are sewn and we're going to understitch the arm side. I'm going to open out that lining so that I can access that arm side seam allowance and press it toward the lining. Then just as we did along the neckline, we're going to sew the seam allowance to the lining. Once you've sewn as far as your presser foot will allow, backstitch to secure. And repeat for the other side of the arm side. And do this on both sides of the bodice. And then give those arm sides a good press. Open out your front and back bodice pieces away from each other once again. And open out the main and lining pieces at the underarm seam. Then place your opened out main and lining pieces of the front and back right sides together at their corresponding side seams. And pin in place. Repeat for both side seams. Sew these seams from the bottom of the lining straight across that underarm seam to the bottom of the main fabric with a 3/8 inch seam allowance, and then finish the seam allowance. To hem the bottom of the garment, the pattern instructions has you folding the bottom raw edge of the main and the lining to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, and then additionally pressing it to the wrong side by 3/8 of an inch. To maintain some of the length at the bottom of the bodice, I've gone ahead and finished the raw edges all around the bottom edge for both the main and the lining fabrics. And I'm going to press those finished edges to the wrong side by 1/4 of an inch, again for the main and lining fabrics. Once my hem is pressed, I'll take it to the sewing machine and sew close to my finishing stitches all the way around, doing this for both layers. And now your victory tank is complete. Thank you for watching this sew along. Make sure you subscribe to the channel so you don't miss notifications every time a full-length sewing tutorial comes out. And I'll see you in the next video.